Yeah, I'm glad to see so many friends and colleagues. Everyone is invited to turn on the video, but this is not a requirement, of course. Yeah, I think we should start, and I will introduce you shortly to the series and today's speaker. So welcome to another edition of our seminar cycle on Digital and Public Humanities, organized by the Center for Digital and Public Humanities at Foscari University in Venice. This seminar is being recorded, so I hope we will have a lively discussion afterwards, or if you make comments in the chat or in other way, please be aware this will be published in due course after the seminar on our YouTube channel. Thank you everyone for organizing the series. Stefano Dall'Aglio, who's organizing the series, is not present today, but thank you anyway. Thank you, Elena Alessandra, for the technical support in the backlog. It's now a great pleasure for me to introduce you to, where are my notes? I know who it is. Jean-Baptiste Cons, who is currently visiting professor here at our department for Studi Umanistici, for humanities, for digital textual scholarship. And usually he is associate professor in computational philology at the École Nationale des Arts in Paris. He obtained a PhD from Paris Sorbonne in 2016 on the digital critical edition of an old French epic, the Le Chansons d'Autinel. He worked on medieval Occitan literature, specifically the troubadour chansonniers produced in Venice and the Veneto area. I didn't know that there was troubadour music, so I'm ignorant of this. Applying quantitative methods. And his areas of interest include digital scholarly editing and deep learning for handwritten text recognition, lemmatization, and collation, as well as computational text analysis and stematology. He does apply stylometric methods and tools not only on medieval texts. So very recently, he published with a team from, where is it? The Swiss team is from Bern, no, from Zurich.
From actually a private startup of analytics.
Okay, and his a team from Paris where they applied stylometry on a corpus of tweets of the conspiracy theorists which are behind the AQAnon group. So they found out that these are fairly ordinary people, so no high grade military experts, so it's just human beings. So that was a very interesting finding, and was featured as a leading article in the New York Times. So if you Google it, or if you check the email, the tweets, so you will find this article, very interesting article. So that's what you can do as a digital medievalist, digital philologist as well. So I'm very happy to see that this is really useful also in other contexts. Here today, you are talking about what philology is actually about now and in the future, according to your vision. You will present your research and also refer to models of textual transmission and related subjects like loss of estimates. So how much literature have we lost? So there was an interesting article very recently by Mike Kestemont and a colleague, and you are taking a different approach. So this will be very exciting to see how they complement or confirm the findings. And on stemata collections. So all very hot topics. And the title of your presentation today is Data-Centric Models for Digital Critical Editions. And yeah, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Franz, for the kind introduction. I don't know if you hear me. Do you hear me correctly? Okay, great. So I'm very happy to be here today in this beautiful room in Venice and with you distantly to talk about data-centric models for digital critical editions and more broadly about data-centric philology. I'll just start to share the slides. It should be a minute, okay? So are you all seeing the slides or no? I guess so. Perfect. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about data-centric philology. And this term could, yes. Oh, yes. That will be a lot more comfortable, yes. So I was saying I was going to talk about data-centric philology, and this term maybe can make you react already at the very beginning, because in a way, all philology is data-centric to some extent. Philology has always been about data. It's not an abstract, formal endeavor. It's not mathematics or philosophy. Philology isn't about constructing elaborate formal models, but it's about dealing with artifacts from the past, such as manuscripts, old manuscripts, old prints, papyri, etc., to study texts and cultures of the past. So it's really something that has a strong material connection to the material world, like other sciences, such as, I don't know, archaeology or biology or many others. Of course, there are differences in philological traditions, and this emphasis on material philology is perhaps stronger in some philological traditions, like in France, especially after Bédier, there was a strong focus on the document and on material philology. But actually, philology isn't just about data, it's also about models and theory. When we build a stemma, when we study the transmission of a text, when we try to reflect on how text can have been transmitted, we are actually elaborating model and thinking in terms of theory, be it theory about edition, theory about reconstruction, about transmission, etc. And it's quite an important subject, especially in some tradition like the German philological tradition or the Italian tradition, where there is a lot of effort on the research on the process of transmission of text and the transformation that it implies in the text itself, the types of textual variations, for instance, process such as diffraction and so on. And sometimes it goes up to a very algorithmic point, like in math studies about Leitfehler und stematische Typen, where he thought about all the stemata shapes that were possible for a given number of witnesses, and he tried to define all these types and quantify them, so it can get quite theoric, actually. On this more formal theoretic aspect, when we think about intuitions and models, philology actually shares quite a few elements with some other disciplines like biology and linguistics. And these common roots, the term is quite relevant here because we are going to talk about three. The common roots go back at least to the 18th century and even before. And philology, biology, linguistics, they all share the same metaphor of the one-to-many genealogy or the tree as a way of expressing relations in the objects they study. For linguistics, it goes back almost to the Bible and this metaphor of this parable of Babel, where differences in languages between humans are expressed in genealogical terms, in the terms of the descendant of Noah. So human biology and family is put in regard with the diversity of languages. And it's also something that we see in the 18th century in the research in philology or biology. For instance, Lamarck is tried to express the variety he observed between species, animal species on Earth as a genealogy going back to the first life forms. And in other fields, in philology, scholars such as Bengal, on his Apparatus Criticus ad Novum Testamentum, published in Tübingen in 1763, expressed the idea that all the relations between the variant readings he observed in the tradition could be expressed in some sort of a genealogical table, in the same way that you could express relationship between nations, tribes, families, and so on. So there is always this common genealogical and tree-like model that is shared by this discipline. That's something that is known, that's been discussed by Tim Panaro, for instance, on his book on the birth of the Armenian method, by Carlo Ginzburg, and more recently by Relly et al. In the Handbook of Stematology. It's quite something that is quite formalized a bit later in the 19th century, where we see the first stemata appear, actual stemata in philological studies, starting in 1827 with this tree that you see here, that might be the very first stemma ever produced, expressing the link between the manuscripts of Swedish law. And 10 years later, in Darwin works, transmutation of species, and then afterwards the evolution of species, you see the tree metaphor again, expressing a relationship between species and living beings. And you see it also in linguistic with Schleicher, with in part inspired by Darwin in defining the relation between Indo-European languages and looking for Ursprache to all this, a common root to all these languages. So the tree metaphor is common, and another aspect which is common is this idea of variation or mutation as a way of elaborating classifications of objects. So in the same way as philology studies text to build a stemma using common errors, common innovations, or textual mutations, linguistics have this metaphor of the language family tree, and biology use actual genetic mutation to reconstruct phylogenetic trees of the evolution of species. So this idea of variation, innovation as a way to classify objects is also common. And in philology, it has been, for instance, clearly expressed by Leger in 1903, when he said that a family of manuscripts is constituted by their common errors, or if one prefers this more exact term, by their common innovations. So this was just an introductory way of putting forward this postulate that philology, this definition that philology is a science of texts and the science of their evolution, that it's one of the evolutionary sciences that exist, and studies text in similar ways as biology studies living organisms or linguistics study language varieties. So I have here to distinguish perhaps between philology as an auxiliary science, whose goal is to produce texts for others to use, for literary scholars or historians to use, and philology as a science in itself with its own goal, and then its goal would be to understand how texts are transmitted and to try to describe the processes of textual transmission on a more general scale. And I really sincerely think that in order to do that, philology has to work on both its legs, data on one end and theory and formal models on the other. So that's something I've tried to express here with this illustration, with the idea that we can have a double approach to our object of studies, data-centric approach, and the more theoretic or mechanistic approach on the other end. So on one end, we always start, of course, from the available sources to us, manuscripts, old prints, and so on. And from this source, we'll try to extract and formalize data under the form of edition, digital editions, encoded texts, databases, and so on. And we will then use this data to apply statistical analysis or more human qualitative close reading analysis in order to get some results that are actually a direct emanation of the data that we have been studying. But on the other hand, I think that to enlighten that, we need to confront it with results from a more theoretic approach that takes the problem the other way around, starting with theoretical frameworks and hypotheses, formal hypotheses that can be then used to build generative models that will try to reproduce the process of transmission, textual variation, and so on. And we can even go as far as try to simulate them and obtain artificial results that we can compare to actual data and see if we can, in this way, try to understand the process behind the data that we observe. So it's not just about analyzing data, it's about understanding how this data came to be, in the same way as, for instance, physicists try to formalize the process that leads to an apple falling from a tree. It's not just about observing apples falling and writing down that 99% of the apples are falling. It's about making an hypothesis, theory about gravity, about such force that you cannot observe, but which can reproduce the phenomenon that you are observing. So you can then confront both approaches and again, better interpretation of your sources and reformulation of your knowledge and your theoretical, your theories about textual transmission. That was my first part. I will then proceed with these two legs that I just defined. And so in the first time, I will be really focusing on data models and data structure for digital critical editions on the more obvious sense of how do we produce and structure data for this kind of digital critical editions, something on which I intend to work during my stay here in Venice. On the other hand, I will talk about more theoretic approaches and generative models applied to the transmission of texts. So to start with the data aspect, I'll start in a perhaps, let's say, classical fashion by talking about the data deluge. We are living in a data deluge since the beginning of the 21st century. The quantities of data that are available to us are always increasing and increasing, not just linearly, but exponentially. A good example, for instance, is the number of documents that are available on the French National Library, Gallica. When it started around 1997, you had a few hundred documents, and now you have more than 8 million documents that are available. And you can see here on the left a progressive increase in the quantity of documents, and it's just not that, let's say, 1,000 documents is added each year, but it's multiplication. And you see, the more we move forward in time, the more it increases very rapidly. So how are we going to survive this deluge of information, this overflow of information, and how can we handle always increasing quantities of data? And this data is not just images, actually, it's also text. Here you have on the top row the quantities of documents. Here it's only monographs and books by century. You have manuscripts on the left and prints on the right. And you have those without text in, I don't know if it's orange or pink, and in blue you have those with a text layer constructed by automated recognition. And you see that, well, for prints, there is already an important quantity that has a text layer that we can directly query. So we have full text research, full text search inside the print collection, even for some older prints. And for manuscript, we do not have it yet, but it will come in the next decade, perhaps. And we are actually already working in Paris with the Bibliothèque Nationale to create workflows to add text layer to a manuscript and have a full text search in the manuscript. So it does not mean that every document has a text layer yet, or that it's always really usable, but I think we'll get there, and perhaps relatively soon. So this, let me go back to my questions of editions. With this question, if we got full text search in collections of documents, why do we need editions for already? If we can just query directly the books, the manuscripts, the prints, why do we need to make editions in the first place? Well, let me just start from the definition of philology that I just suggested before, as a science of text and their evolution, about the necessary articulation of data and theory, and add this last fact, that is the broad availability of source digitization and the progress of HTR methods. All this, I think, are starting to cause a loss of relevance for the single source copy text editing approaches, or the new philology-like approaches where you are going to edit a single document and focus on a single document. And I think it gives a new relevancy to more critical approaches where you're trying to make sense of a full textual tradition and not just the document. The document also, of course, but you are trying to place it inside a broader framework, which is a transmission of a text. So in some ways, the future is critical. That's what I meant with this image of Gaston Paris in a futuristic setting like this. I believe that to make sense, to stay useful, editions no more than ever have to be not just tools to provide a text or transcription, but they have to be instruments of knowledge of a textual tradition, and they have to provide, let's say, insights on how given work has been circulated, or it was transmitted, or it was transformed, or it was received, and so on. And also, especially for digital editions, they have to be transparent, structured, semantic data that can be then reused in different settings. So in order to of data, I would like to talk about now the workflows that we are trying to set in place with my team in Paris to ally human philologist intelligence with the machine and artificial intelligence, and try to see how both can go hand in hand. And the idea is having a process with several steps, and at each step there is some form of cooperation between the researcher and the machine. So we start with vast deposits of digital facsimile that we can query through with triple IF. And I realized that this workflow, and just a quick digression, has quite many similarities with the one that Lino Leonardi showed last week in his talk here in Venice. It's not exactly the same form, but it's part of the same steps. So we start with triple IF, and we use it to mine stores of digital facsimile, such as digital library, and get images. This image will then submit them to layout analysis to get segmented images, and ideally where we can distinguish between different types of zones, for instance, illustration, text, and so on. We then submit it to text recognition in order to get raw text, and this raw text we will then enrich it with further normalizations such as lemmatization, post tagging, linguistic tagging, morphological tagging, and so on. And then we get for each witness, each document that interests us, an enriched text that we can already analyze in many interesting ways, such as doing data mining like stylometry, for attribution or scriptometry, for localizing in space and time a given document, and so on. But if we want to go towards critical editions, digital critical editions, and they are a bit rare right now, so we have to try and go there. We need to go to the next phase with alignment and collation. So there are already brilliant tools for that developed by research teams, for instance, There's collatex that you probably have heard of, and other tools. So we need to try to use these wonderful tools to align and collate the different witnesses and get a collation with the different witnesses of the same work that are aligned, and we can then try to analyze the variants, annotate them, and use them to build critical editions. So I'll just go quickly on these different steps, presenting tools that we are using or trying to improve or developing for some of them. And I'll start with layout analysis. So here the goal is to distinguish different areas of the layout on the page. For that, right now we use the interface provided by eScriptorium, and the engine is Kraken, both tools that have been developed in Paris as part of the Scripta project by Benjamin Kissling and others. And so we try to train models to recognize the different areas of the page according to a controlled vocabulary that we are working on, which we call segmento. And the idea is to identify the different zones such as decoration area, latrines, initials, figures, musical notations, damage areas, page numbers, and so on, to be able to have semantic representation of the page. Even before we get the text, we distinguish these different kinds of areas. We have also different kinds of lines, and we try to standardize it so that we can reuse data from different manuscripts, different projects, to train common models of layout recognition. So the next step would be handwritten text recognition, or let's say historical text recognition, because sometimes there are also incunabula which are a bit hard to transcribe automatically, and even some old prints, it's not always easy. So the tools are the same here, but you don't need just tools, you need also data and models to train models. And we are trying to have an open source collection of training material and models for HTR, which is available on GitHub under the HTR United organization. And you have, for instance, a data set about medieval French manuscript that goes with a model, and this model already has more than around 95% success rate on the training material, and then you can reuse it for your own sources. And we have been experimenting with different approaches to HTR, such as single-step HTR, where you just have the source and the normalized transcription, and you try to train the HTR engine to transcribe, resolve abbreviations, etc., all in one step. Or you can try to decompose this with more specialist models that will play a role at different steps. And then you can have one model that will transcribe, but without touching the abbreviations. See that below. Then you have another model that will try to see where the spaces should go, where the words boundaries are. And then you will have a third specialist model that will perform expansion, that will try to resolve the abbreviation. So there are two different approaches, and it's not clear right now which one is the most efficient. Probably depends on the situation and the quantity of data that you have for the different tasks. After that, we have annotation, and one of the most, let's say, frequent steps of annotation and most useful for the further exploitation is lemmatization. So it's a process of linking every token of the text to a dictionary entry, a standardized form of a dictionary entry, so that you can then bypass all the orthographic spelling variation that you will encounter, especially in older sources. So for that, we have trained here two lemmatization models. We've used the engine that has been developed by Enrique Monjavacas and Mike Estemont and others, that is called Pi, and we have been training models, annotating data and training models for Old French, Latin, Ancient Greek, Middle French, Modern French, and a few others, and Middle Dutch as well. And when we get more data, we can train models for other languages. And we have provided with an API when you can just input your text and then have them lemmatized, or you can download the models and use your own Python code to apply them. So there are, of course, other types of annotation that could be interesting that we could perform, like named entities recognition and so on. But for now, we are focusing on annotation because it's interesting for us for the next steps. Namely, one of the steps that we need to continue working on right now is automated collation of different witnesses. We made already some experiments on that a few years ago with Lucence Ing and Elena Spadini. Knowing that one of the problems for automated collation, especially for medieval vernacular texts, is quantity of variation that you observe. Texts sometimes have a huge quantity of variation, and you also have a lot of spelling, linguistic variation, because you often have manuscripts that are far away in time or far away in space, and you can have like a manuscript from Eastern France, one from England, one from Northern Italy, and they all have their own linguistic variants. And you don't want to organize them according to dialect. You want to organize them according to the variation in substance of the reading. So lemmatization is a way of bypassing this kind of spelling variation. So that's why it's useful for us. And then we can use tools like collatics that I mentioned in order to do the alignment between the different versions. And when the alignment is correct, we can actually even use the linguistic annotation to try to categorize automatically the different variant locations according to the tags. So for instance, if two readings have the same lemma, so the same standard form, the same part of speech, the same morphology, but it's just the spelling that is different, we can know that we have a graphematic spelling variant, and we can label it automatically as a spelling variant, of course with some amount of error due to the accuracy of the annotation, but to a point. If the spelling is different and then the morphology is different as well, we can have just a flexional variant, for instance, singular versus plural, or indicative versus subjunctive, and so on. So it's not yet a really substantial variation, but it's already something more. If the spelling, morphology, and part of speech are different, but the lemma is the same, we can label it as morphosyntactic variation, which is quite rare, but can happen. Like you have a verb that is suddenly nominalized, for instance. And then you have lexical variation where everything is different, especially the lemma. And then you have words that can refer to different meanings and different objects. Sometimes we want to go beyond this simple distinction because all lexical variations are not as strong. So we could want then to try to distinguish derivational lexical variation where the root is the same, but it's just a prefix or suffix has been added, like créanté, accréanté, basically the same meaning, but if you are missing one syllable, you can use one instead of the other. More paradigmatic variation, so using synonyms or coeponyms or hyperonyms, like I don't know, poodle, dog, cat, dog, mammal, and so on. And you have then more strong semantic variation, where the link between the two lexical units is let's say, well, the two lexical units are more distant, and you can try to perhaps establish that using semantic representation of the word, like embeddings, but we haven't gone that far yet. So this kind of data that we can generate with this workflow is sufficient for already many analyses that we can perform, many statistical analysis of the data. For instance, we can do paleographic or scriptometric analysis. In this case, you have factor analysis that was performed on a corpus of medieval French epic manuscripts using variant letter forms, bigrams, to try to see if we could distinguish between scribes and localize them in time and build some sort of tool to date manuscripts or date copies from the formal variants of the scribes. And it worked up to a point, because you can see here on the left that we go from the older manuscripts, the one in black, it's clearly the older manuscript, to the most recent one, the one in yellow. It actually has a colophon saying that it dates from the beginning of the 14th century. So a century later than the one in blue and black. So in a way, we are going towards tools we can try to date relatively manuscripts using this kind of analysis, at least as a complement to other approaches. We can also do scriptometric analysis or dialectometric analysis to try to detect if such a manuscript is from northern, eastern, western France, or from England, and so on, based on the spelling variants that you can observe inside the copies. You can also use it to do scribal analysis or stylometric analysis. Or as I heard recently, the term stylochronometry, if you want to date the manuscripts on stylistic grounds. Here, for instance, is cluster analysis from a work we did a few years ago with Thibaut Cléris and Ariane Pinche on an old French collection of saints' lives. And we are trying to see if there were groupings of the saint lives that fit the traditional hypothesis regarding the construction of the compilation. So here we're inside the question of stylometry, but also of transmission. Can we try to see pre-existing units in the grouping that we can do on stylometric grounds? And it actually fits quite closely, not completely, but quite closely, the hypotheses that were made on the construction of this compilation by Paul Meyer more than a century ago. And you see that the texts, the lives, they are colored here according to the hypothetical groupings that Meyer formulated, and stylometric analysis tends to confirm this grouping with a few exceptions. And we think that for this exception, we might have right, and Meyer might have made here a mistake, but it's really limited. So you see, we can confirm most of his approach on this text. So data is good. Data is enough to already make some verification of hypotheses and to formulate some observation, but it's not enough. Individual data points, such as one manuscript, one collection, one text, it tells us little in itself, and even larger data sets, they are relatively meaningless if we do not have a pre-existing hypothesis, a model, or a theory to test in our analysis of this collection, or of this data set, of this text, and a framework to interpret them. So that's I'm going to switch to my third and last point. Maybe I will be a bit short on time, so I'll try to not be too long. So maybe I'll skip some parts and can come back if there are questions. Water for you. Thank you. So just catch my breath. So early on the session, I said that the core problem of philology as a science in itself is the study of the evolution of text and the textual transmission of text. And if we want to address that on a global scale, not on the scale only of individual texts, but on a more general level, we need a common framework that can account for already existing observations or investigations in different areas that we have been studying. And each time I made a parallel with biology, because it's often helps understanding the applications that we can have in philology as well. There is one aspect. Aha, thank you. Scusa. There is one aspect which I call population dynamics, which actually also echoes the recent research that Franz mentioned at the beginning, published in Science by Mike Kestemon, Volker Karsdorp, etc., about the estimates of the loss of works and manuscripts based on ancient species model from biology and biodiversity studies. So there were also, before the work of Slisn, also published in Science about manuscripts as fossils and studying populations of manuscripts and their evolution in time with tools from paleodemography and so on. So here the idea is to try to model or observe the evolution in time and the values of manuscript populations, and try to understand how do the birth rate, the productivity, the number of copies that were made interact with the number of destruction to, in the end, give us the surviving manuscript that we have now. So if we have 5 manuscripts of a text, does it mean that only 5 were copied and none destroyed? Does it mean that 50 were copied and only 5 kept, 45 destroyed? Does it mean that 500 were copied, and so on? And was it a fixed number in time? Of course not. So for instance, if I have 5 manuscripts now, how many were there in the 19th century? How many were there in the 16th century? How many were there in the 14th century? And so on. Of course, it's a very hard question, but we can try to approach them through abstract models or generative models. Another aspect is thematology, which in another field could be called phylogenetics. So the study of the properties of trees as we can recover them from witnesses. So why do we observe the shape that we observe in the tree of texts or the tree of life? And if I can see a tree with 2 branches, does it mean that in the origin it had only 2 branches, or that it had 4 branches, perhaps 5 branches, and we have only 2 left, and so on? So how many branches have we lost? Or how can we be sure that we are going to preserve that branch or not, and so on? And can we try to reproduce the dynamic processes that give us these shapes? And the last one is ecosystemic approach, or an approach to reception. So is there something that gives some text or some manuscript a higher fitness value over some other texts, some other manuscripts? Do manuscripts need to have some sort of privileged ecosystem to strive, and other ecosystems will have them destroyed more often, and so on? So phenomena such as taste, fashions, vulgate texts, literary evolutions, historical context, linguistic evolution, evolution in the mode of copying text, and so on. All that can have an impact on as well, and is already an object of study, but needs to be articulated with the 2 other items. So I think that at the intersection of these 3 areas, there is a possible answer to something that I think has proven the most problematic observation in philology until now, perhaps the most insightful observation as well. But an observation that has been often misunderstood, even by the one who made it at first, as a methodological flaw or a methodological problem, when really, I believe, it's most likely a substantial observation about textual transmission. So if we look here at the stemmata, we have quite a few different stemmata. We have the Song of Roland, edited by Cesare Segre. We have the Life of Alexis, edited by François Zufferet. We have the Song of Aspremont, edited by Giovanni Palumbo. We have two early modern Italian texts studied by Paolo Trovato, and then we have the works of Conon de Béthune, French Trouvère, and here in the bottom right. So when we look at all these stemmata from various times, various texts, various philologists, we are struck by some common properties that they have. One of these properties is that almost always at the root, you only have two branches going from the root. For instance, for Roland, at the top left, you have one branch alpha with a single manuscript and one branch beta with all the other manuscripts, going down until the Venice manuscripts, V4, for instance. It's the same for Apremont, and actually it's the same for Alexis and so on. And then if we look at the branch, we saw also that they are quite unequal. And sometimes we have a branch, most of the time we have a branch with a single manuscript or two manuscripts, and all the rest is in the other branch. And if we go down the tree, we see this kind of structure always happening, repeating themselves. That the famous observation that Bédier made, he called that the Silva Portentosa, or the ominous forest. When he remarked in 1913 and 1928 that the vast majority of trees actually show a root bifurcation. And he thought that's probably a problem with philologists. They want to have a root bifurcation, so they are putting root bifurcation everywhere. And from that, he took a disruptive stance toward a philological method and renounced some part of the reconstruction approach because of this observation that I believe can be explained not by bias, but by an actual phenomenon in the data and in the transmission of text. Just a quick note, by doing that, Bédier forgets all the texts that are in a single manuscript, which do not have a bifurcation at the top of the tree because we have a single witness, so there's no bifurcation at all. But just in passing remark. Actually, Bédier, we remember it for that, but he was not the first to make this observation, and his master, Gaston Paris, already made it in 1872, and already linked it to the question of the loss of manuscripts. And he said that nowhere is the immensity of the losses we have suffered in medieval manuscripts more evident than when we possess several texts of the same work. Indeed, it is infinitely rare for one of these texts to be copied from the other. Almost always, there are the extreme shoots of perfectly distinct branches, which form a vast ramification around the stem, which we never possess. We already made the observation of the peculiar form of stemmata and linked it to the process of transmission and destruction of manuscript. And I think that's also where the answer lies. So it's a central issue. There has been quite some work on it. I will not talk about it too long, but broadly, there have been descriptive approaches, people trying to quantify how many stemmata had root bifurcation and so on. There were more mathematical combinatorial approach. For instance, how many stemma with bifurcation you can count for 3 nodes, 4 nodes, 5 nodes, and so on. And there were decimation-based or loss-based approach. For instance, Trovato worked recently on that, where you actually build trees and then you delete a part of the manuscript. You simulate the process of destruction, and then you count the shapes that result from the manuscript, the decimation that you have made. So it's an interesting approach, but it's a bit static, and we'll see how we can try to go beyond that. Just another word before, bifidity, this kind of root bifurcation at the top, the fact that there are only two main branches, is not the only property that is interesting and peculiar in stemata. There are also other properties that we could want to monitor. For instance, the fact that the root is an archetype only or the original itself. Have we lost all the rest of the tradition and only kept a small branch with its archetype, or can we go back up to the actual original text? So it's very different. Is there some kind of direct descent between two witnesses? It's extremely rare, as Gaston Paris said, but it can happen. Are the branches equal, or do they have different, very different number of manuscripts? Do we have contamination? Do we have extra-thematic contamination that can indicate the loss of a full branch, and so on? So all these properties are interesting as well, even though they are sometimes left out. So I believe to answer that, we have to build a theoretical, conceptual framework. And I believe in this framework, we see we need to set two important notions at first, two drivers for this transmission of text. And one is variation that causes the number of branch and the number of variants to increase. Can be accidental or intentional variation when you rewrite part of the text. And on the other end, we have a tendency to fixation that decreases diversity, and the general tendency to extinction is the same with living organisms. You have mutation all the time, but most mutation disappear because the branch that had this mutation go extinct. So probably for text, it's something similar. Most variants have disappeared already because they were in branches that have disappeared. And we only have a small portion of all the variants that have existed. But all the times new variants, new mutation are introduced, and the process is in perpetual dialectic between variation and fixation. The question now from that is, how does it happen that we have kept some variants, some branches, some manuscript, and not other? Is there some purely random process, a purely mechanistic process due to chance, or is there some form of selection of the fittest, like in biology, where some variants have a higher value and some version of the text, some manuscripts have a higher value than other? It's actually a similar problem that we encounter in biology, in the debate between the Darwinistic approach of the survival of the fittest and the approach of the genetic drift that actually says that most mutations in living beings are kept or disappear only due to chance and not to an advantage they would procure to the living beings. Because if you start with a population of which 50% has a mutation and 50% has another mutation, well, in a few generations, with only chance, you will have one of them that will disappear and the other will remain. So pure chance can explain quite a lot, but probably not all of this process. So if we want to measure the deviations with due to chance, we have to first try to reproduce what we would observe if it was only due to chance. I don't know if it's clear, but the idea is to build what statisticians call a null model. So a model that reproduces the process, but in a purely random stochastic fashion, without biases. So the idea would be there to build a model that reproduces the process of copy and destruction of a manuscript in a dynamic fashion, without bias, so in a purely random way. And then compare that to the actual data that we have and try to see if it's different, if we actually measure deviations from chance or purely random process. So to that, we have to use the tools from the complex systems field tools that are already quite common in statistical physics, climate science, biology, even economics, and other fields, to try to build formal models, generative models that can reproduce in a way the behaviors that we try to analyze in the data. So we want here to model the process of copy of manuscript, transmission of copies, and so on, and the process of destruction of manuscript. There already been some work on that by a scholar called Weizmann in the 80s, which made quite some important work, and more recently by Paolo Canettieri and Amin Önen. They've worked on, let's say, semi-dynamical approach to this. I think we can build on that and suggest new approach. So I've been working with a physicist called Julien Rondon-Furling, and we have been experimenting with stochastic models, namely birth and death process, which is a type of model where you give a death probability and a copy probability, birth probability to agents, and then you simulate thousands of textual transmission, and then you can observe if what you get is similar in a way to the actual transmission of text. So it's an abstract construct, but it can perhaps help you understand what is happening in the real world. For instance, here is what we call a phase diagram. It results from 1,000 simulations with two, let's say, if we don't have to scale, but I'll explain. So basically you have a graph that is made according to two parameters. One is the probability of being born, that goes from left to right, or the probability of having a child, if you prefer, at a given step in time. So you have one chance in 100, or one chance in 10, or one chance in 2 to have a child at each step, or 1 on 1. And the probability of dying from bottom to top, probability of 1 in 100, 1 in 10, etc. And for each pair of value, for instance, 1 chance on 2 to be destroyed and 1 on 10 to be copied, we do simulations. We do 1,000 simulations, and then we estimate the shape of the resulting generated artificial data. And here, for instance, we look at how many bifurcations we observe at the roots compared to other types of multifurcations, so 3 branches, 4 branches, and so on. And the warmer the color here, the closer to yellow, the closer we are to 100% bifurcation, so 2 branches. And you see that for a vast part of the diagram, we obtain only stemata, almost only stemata that have bifurcation. So it seems quite, there is a large part of this diagram that is coherent with Bédier's observation. And then after that, we can try to triangulate values. We're not there yet, but we're working towards that. For instance, for a given productivity rate and loss rates that you know from somewhere else, you can retrieve the stemata shapes that you would expect in your simulation. Or if you have the stemata shape and the loss rate, you can estimate the production. And if you have the production and the stemata shape, you can estimate the loss rates. And you can see they are all coherent, consistent between themselves. And then you can confront the results from this artificial model with real-world data. And that's what we are trying to do. So here, for instance, you have on the left, you have the result of a bunch of simulations that we made. And on the right, you have estimation made on actual stemata made from philologists from actual textual traditions. And you have, for instance, a proportion of, well, the number of root bifurcation, of the trifurcation, and so on. So you see that we have similar shape. In both cases, we have a huge domination of stemata with 2 main branches. We have quite a few with 3 branches, and then we have almost none with 4, 5, or 6 branches. So it seems consistent. And below you have the number of node locations, not just the roots, but for each manuscript, how many descendants does he have? And you see that most manuscripts in the simulation or in the actual schemata do not have any descendants at all, but there are quite a few that have 1 or 2 descendants. And then there are really, really small numbers that have 3, 4, 5, 6 descendants. So it seems to a point to be coherent with the exception of node with 1 single descendant, and that's the question of the direct filiation that we do not observe a lot. Gaston Paris already said that in our schemata. Perhaps we missed some kind of direct filiation, perhaps not. Perhaps there is another explanation. Perhaps there is a deviation from chance here. So we need to investigate that further. I'll go very fast on the last slide, just to say that we can use all kinds of data from actual textual traditions to compare to our models. We can look at the distribution of witness per text to try to estimate if it's coherent with the schemata shape. You see that, for instance, here we see that in most texts that we have are in single witness, so that we can try to compare that to the results of our simulation. We can try to use already suggested estimates about loss rates. One of the very rare cases when we have actual historical data on loss rates. For instance, for the Venetian incunabula that have been studied by Paolo Trovato, we know that for some editions, we have the number of actual copies that were made. So we know we have kept only 1% of the copies or less than 1% of the copies. So we can get some estimates there to cross-reference with our simulations. The same for death rate. But into the future, we will need to investigate also variations because in time, because probably the death rate, the production rate, they are not stable during all the transmission of the text, but they vary through time. So I will not go too deep into that, but there are phenomena such as mass extinctions that we can observe for biodiversity, and probably we can observe them also for manuscripts. For instance, when there is an important typological shift in writing methods, or when we go from volumen to book, when we go to Caroline to Gothic scripts, maybe this kind of events can have localized but very important influence on the manuscript living at this point. For instance, when you change your writing style, quickly the manuscripts that have already been copied in the previous writing style will become illegible. So you will lose quite a good number of them, but you will keep manuscript in the new writing style. So there are this kind of events need to be taken into account. And just to conclude, to be able to move further forward, one thing we will need is data on the schemata that we are made by philologists in time. And for that, we have launched a project, an open source collection of schemata, where we are trying to collect online in a collaborative fashion all the schemata that were produced for the text that interest us, and everybody can participate. We just need submission of a transcription of the schemata and some metadata with them, saying what kind of text it is, what's the edition, and so on. And we are trying in particular to build a complete collection of schemata for medieval European epics, romances, and lyric poetry. So if you are working in this area, do not hesitate to get in touch with us to participate in building this collection that is not just for us, but for everyone. And in particular, I would like to increase the collection regarding Latin texts, medieval Italian, Middle Welsh, Middle English, and Norse texts, which we do not have in the collection right now, but there would be good additions. So to conclude, because I've been very long already, well, in philology, we didn't have the chance to have someone like Darwin in the 19th century that formulated completely a global theoretical framework to explain the evolution of text. We've had some insight by people such as Gaston Paris, and then we've had Bédier, who made the observations that could have triggered this theoretical formulation, but stopped there and did not go further. So it's our job now to do what Bédier didn't do and to try to arrive at this formulation. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste. So that was worth every minute, I would say. So I'm really glad you didn't cut anything out here. So thank you for giving a glance to the future of philology, which has already begun, as it seems, and how to bring together the past and the present and the future in digital philology. So that's very encouraging, and it's also an open enterprise, so everyone can participate. And I'm glad you're teaching the students here this semester also, and I hope something will come out of this also here in Venice. So we have now enough time also for questions. So this is an interdisciplinary seminar. Everyone is welcome to ask basic question, simple question from your particular background. Of course, the specialists are invited to ask very specific questions. You can raise your hand. We should switch maybe to the view of all participants. Yeah, that's good. And you can leave a note in the chat. So just write that you have a question, or you type key your questions into the chat, and I can give you the word then, or you just shout here into the room. We are 34 participants left, and some in the audience. Do we have a microphone, just in case someone is asking here, so that we make sure everyone can follow the question? Okay, so please take benefit of the remaining time here and ask a question to Jean-Baptiste. I think there are many things that can be clarified that are worthwhile to be discussed. You can also switch on your video if you're not fallen asleep. Or change your wardrobe. Yeah, Tiago, so you are the first, please.
Hi. So first, congratulations. It was very, very good, very exciting work you're doing. And I was really interested because you're doing with thematology some things that people have started to do with historical linguistics as well, which is to model the parameters and try different parameters and see which tree you get. And I really like the fact that you were touching that we usually are not counting direct copies. So it was really nice to see your graph where you are assuming a lot of direct copies with one descendant and many others didn't. I had actually two more of technical questions. So you were discussing that you had a rates of birth and death. I don't know if we're just making it simpler for explanation, but are they really rates, or they are like distributions? And if they are distributions, they are relaxed distributions in the sense that a long time each copy can have different rates. That was one thing. And the second, it was not clear, maybe you mentioned in the mist, you are modeling only the topology as far as I could tell. So you were not modeling the rate of change from one manuscript to the potential descendants. Thanks again for the presentation. It was very, very nice.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think we need to discuss that further after, because these are very, very interesting points. And indeed, yes, for now we are on a quite simple birth and death process with just a birth and death probability, not a distribution, but a uniform probability. And the next step for us is to have variable rates. Well, it's not completely true. We have a variable birth rate because we have capped the population with the idea that there was a limit to the number of copies a text could have. Once you reach a state where everyone has a copy of the text, probably the production will go more slowly. So there is just a limit, and when you get closer to this limit, the birth rate decreases progressively, as in a logistic growth equation, basically. But one of our main goals for the future is, of course, to have variable rates, either variable in time or variable according to branches on some other aspects. And in the, let's say, longer term, we'd also like to have some sort of geo-temporal models in the same way that they exist in biology, when you can have different values for different niche and different periods. So that's one aspect. And regarding the evolution of content and the rate of change and so on, that's also clearly something that we want to do. But again, we are not there yet. That's one of the goals for the future, to add some sort of measurement of number of variations that appear, and measurement of diversity of the variants that we kept regarding those that were before, and so on. So that's our two aspects we want to work on, and probably we could benefit from some input from the work being done on linguistic change and from biology, evolutionary biology as well.
Thanks.
More questions? Checking the chat. So not to lose any time. So I have a silly question maybe. So what is your estimate? How much has been lost of manuscript tradition? So that's I mean, that ignores the complexity, of course. But I mean, do you have a guess? And the other question is your pipeline. So I'm fascinated by this pipeline. So starting from layout, recognition to transcript, automated transcript, normalization, lemmatization, collation, and then textual criticism. So evaluating the variants and coming to critical texts, and then to create a large resource of various textual representations from image to critical text. And where do you see the greatest problem? So what has to be addressed, or what is not advanced enough to really press the button and go so close to present to the editor or to a group of editors or to the community? So this is where we are. This is a textual transmission. This has all been done automatically so far, and now your critical input is needed to just make some analysis, or just, I mean, it will be tough enough, but where do you see the work, the most of the work that needs to be done to realize this vision?
Well, regarding the first question about estimates, we do not have those estimates yet, because we are still working on the model.
Still counting. Yeah.
Still counting and comparing to schemata and so on. But if I have to give some insight, it would be that it's actually tremendously variant according to types of tradition, book typology, and so on. And we have some insights of that. I didn't linger long on it because I was lacking time. But for instance, I mentioned the work of Paolo Trovato on the Venetian incunabula, and he realized that, for instance, for let's say more popular chivalric romances printed on smaller formats without too much luxury and so on, decimation could be between 99 and 100% of copies were destructed, while for more formal prints on parchments of low text in Latin and so on, decimation was around only 70%. So I say it's somewhere between 70% and 99.99%, and sometimes going quite closely to 100. For instance, there has been estimation on the Merovingian diplomas produced by the Merovingian administration in France in the 6th, 7th century, and basically keep only 1, 2, perhaps 3 of this diploma, but probably there were a lot more. So here we can imagine that decimation has many 9 after the comma, so it's 99,999 something. So it's in this area, but it's hard to go beyond that for now. And sometimes we'll also have important variation in times for a given type of traditions. For instance, for Old French epics, the manuscripts that were copied in the 12th century, which is the most important period for this typical genre of chansons de geste, are almost all destroyed. Probably there were a lot of them, but there were more destroyed than later manuscripts because of changes in book types, switch from Caroline to Gothic script, switch from small formats to larger formats, and also change in taste, that rewriting that made all the version has been and caused them to disappear faster than later copies. So it does vary a lot, I think. And regarding the other question about the workflow, I'd say that human input is necessary at each step. So basically, after you've done, if you want a perfect result, when you've done layout analysis, you have to correct layout analysis. And when you've done text recognition, if you do not just want to do some statistics on it, but actually analyze the text, you have to correct the HTR. And but some operations are easier than others. And right now, HTR, we know that we can get below 5% of error with enough data and effort, but it's far harder for lemmatization as well. We have enough data and models that can go beyond 95% accuracy. But for instance, for text alignment and collation, it's less mature, I think, and there are a lot more work to be done in this particular area of comparing the variants and aligning them and annotating them.
Thank you. More questions. I'm surprised that alignment is so difficult. So if you got a relatively accurate transcript, then alignment should be.
It depends on the type of traditions that you get. You get some sort of very quiet tradition with only some localized lexical variants. Okay, but often, especially for Old French literature, which is my field, you have kind of macro structural variants where this stanza goes somewhere else in this manuscript and somewhere else in that manuscript. So you need to align the stanza first, and then inside the stanza, sometimes you have verses that are inverted, or and then you need to go inside the verse. And sometimes the verse is the same, but because the dialects are different, you have almost no letter in common between the two, because one is in northern dialect and the other in western dialect, and so there is several layers of difficulty. And because you are in the end of the workflow, you get all the errors from the previous steps. So you get errors in transcription, error in annotation, and all those multiply themselves. So when you arrive at the end, you have far more errors than just at the beginning of the workflow.
Kivilshim, and then Paolo Monella.
Hi, thank you. This is great. I have many questions, but I want to ask a more conceptual question. I'm interested in learning how you define work, text, version. Like, what does it take in your terms for a text to become any work? And I am also wondering, this Gaston Paris reference that you kept mentioning, which, can you give me the details, bibliographic details? Which article, introduction? What did it? Thank you.
For the work of Gaston Paris, it's one of the, let's say, defining works in the history of the beginnings of Romance philology in France. It's an edition of the Saint-Alexis, the Vide Saint-Alexis edition in 1872. Thanks. And especially the introduction in which he makes some sort of early definition of the philological method. As regards the other question you had about work, text, document, I know there are two different vocabularies. Maybe I've been switching between the two, but there is the vocabulary that is the most common in let's say Anglo-Saxon philology, that distinguishes the work as the more conceptual item, the text as the thing you can observe in a document, which is a material aspect. But I've been using them, I think, more in the way we use them in French, is that text basically is the equivalent to work, it's a more abstract unit. And then you have witness, which is the observed text in a document. And then you have the document, the material documents themselves. So that's the difference I would make. But of course, when you go towards questions like what's a version, what's a minor version, a major version, what's a distinct text, a distinct work or not, it's always a question of how do you modulate the lens you are using to watch the tradition. And for instance, you can consider that if you take the stemma of a given work and you cut it at some height, you can consider that the different branches are different versions in a sense. Or if you take two versions, you can consider that there are two different branches of an older, an actual older, more original work. So it's sort of, in a way, it's a question of scale. And you can even go as far as consider all, for instance, chansons de geste as versions of the first chanson de geste, because they all come from this cultural innovation that was the first chanson de geste. So there is some sort of looser affiliation between them. And it's actually an interesting aspect for our analysis, because it makes sense up to a point to compare the data such as the number of childs a manuscript has with data about traditions such as how many witness a given work has, because it's the same mechanism that in the end gives a 4 manuscript to a branch or a 4 manuscript to this song or that novel and so on. That's something I wanted to talk about in the end of, but not much time, but comparing the distribution of witness of copies per text to the number of manuscript per branch is actually an interesting comparison for this reason.
Paolo is struggling with his microphone. In the meantime, Emmanuel, if you want to read your question yourself or elaborate on it yourself.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Very good. Yeah.
Oh yes. It was a question about data, because you said at the beginning that transparency was one of the stakes of these approaches. So simulation, they produce a lot of data at each step of the pipeline. So do you have a framework to deal with this data and to be able not only to keep it as bits of octaves, but also some things that can be intelligible, so that can be documented with the methods and how you use the methods. And then if there are discoveries in the end, how do you trace back to the data? And can you elaborate on that?
Sure. There is actually a word that I did not pronounce during this speech. I realize now, but it's everywhere actually in what I was saying. It's XML and text encoding initiative, because we are storing all the data using canonical data model whose richest expression is made using XML TEI. And I must say there are maybe two different things. There is a single reference canonical form that we want the data to have in the end, which is expressed using the rich semantism of TEI, where all the relevant informations are stored. And then there are, let's say, derived data sets that are produced at the different steps. For instance, when we produce HTR data, we get another format, XML format, which is called Alto. And we use this Alto format to store training data for HTR. But it's not an addition, or it's just training data. So we have like a collection of training data in Alto format for HTR. And then for lemmatization, we have collections of tabular lemmatized corpus with just CSV format and so on. But all of that can be found in the end inside a single file for each text, which is the TI file, and the richest one, even if not the most convenient, I must say, in the workflow. So that's the data preservation and semantic expression of the data. Regarding longer-term storage and access, well, there are a few aspects to that, but mainly my colleagues at the École des Charts, Thibaut Cléris and Vincent Jolivet, are working towards API to get access to text. And so this way you have a like with triple IF and images, you will get a standard way to say, I want this chapter, this work, this chapter, this line, this word, and I want to extract that type of information, and you would get some perennial URL to access and designate this information. And hopefully also to store it on some institutional archive in the long run, such as Zenodo or other archives of this type, to assure that it can be still used in a few years or decades, hopefully.
Okay, thank you. But you don't think it's a too time-consuming task for the researcher to take care of all these data sets and things, or because you need to document them so it can be understood? It's not just what you get from the simulation process. Have you something in place, or how do you deal with that? My question is actually, do you tackle, or how do you make choices, and how do you manage to keep really what's relevant?
Well, the idea there is to go from, let's say, craftsmanship to industry. So we don't want to reinvent formats and encodings and documentation each time. We want to have a single way to do things and to produce more massively. And I'm not the one responsible for that aspect. And that's good, because I haven't this kind of way of thinking, but my colleague Thibaut, he has a very strict, rigorous engineer-like thinking on these questions, and he's the one taking that in charge, and with quite some success. But you have to be to make choices and to accept to have a common representation that the tool will produce. And so always for the researchers, it's a bit hard to accept to lose semantic expressivity and to trade it for more, let's say, streamlined production.
Okay, thank you.
That's very close to the question that Paolo wrote in the chat. So I'm now Paolo speaking. When I argue in favor of multi-layer transcription and collation, other scholars argue that it would take too long compared to traditional selective human collation. What would you reply? So he needs arguments, obviously. And yeah, that's a very existential question. So all this work needs to be justified. So that's so all these tasks are extremely laborious if you do them right. And yeah, what's your answer?
Well, I would be also interested to have his opinion on the subject, because it's a question I've been thinking about a lot, and perhaps my position has evolved on that. When I did my PhD on the song of Otinel in 2016, I had this this way of thinking that I had to do a full edition of the text. So I spent HTR was not very functional at the time, so I did some HTR, but mainly I transcribed, and I spent hours and hours and hours of my PhD looking at all the forms of R and S and D and E on each line. So I was taking a manuscript leave and I was reading it 10 or 15 times. First I was reading only the A's and only the G and only the S, and I kept finding mistakes in what I did before and so on. And in the end, I have this very rich TI format with only verified data, with allographic data, abbreviation data, post tags, all verified lemmas, and then more semantic information and so on. And it makes a very heavy file. And also it makes a single occurrence because I can't compare it with much other files because there are no other file in this format. So no, I mean, quite another different approach, more in the idea that everything worth doing is worth doing badly. And it's better to have a full corpus of transcription with not all the information that you want and perhaps some error, but you can compare the text. So I'm trying more to go towards a more massified approach. And if at some point I need to have information about variant letter forms, then I will use some AI model to add this information. But as long as I don't need it, I stick to having normalized letter forms and abbreviations. But I do not add systematically all layers to all documents. And I try to do it more on a more per goal basis. If I'm doing a research on variant letter forms, I add it. Otherwise, I leave it for the future. I don't know if it's a complete answer to.
I think that's a very pragmatic and very reasonable answer. I'm not sure if this will make the question, those who ask the questions will make them happy, because then you work with more messy data or less on a lower quality level. So that's also something which traditional textual scholars do not like very much.
Actually, so stylometrists like Massey Eder showed that if you want to do just a stylometric analysis, you can have up to 40% of the words wrong, it will still work. So if you have just 10% of HTR error, is it really a big deal for some usage? Of course, if you are doing a verbal word-by-word critique of the spelling, you need no error virtually, but
that's really an offense to traditional scholars. It doesn't matter what's written here, 40% is sufficient. Yeah, we had a very nice workshop in Wuppertal, right, Patrick, on hyperdiplomatic transcriptions and what's the use of this. So in there we had similar discussions. No, do you have an opinion on this, and can you help Paolo? No. Oh, I mean, that's our research, and I mean, we have to stand for our kind of research. I mean, well, which type of research is worthwhile to be funded, or I don't know. So if we have questions, and I mean, but I did. So my PhD was also, I did a hyper diplomatic transcript, and I don't know what's. So I mean, it was a good training for me and to see very many things that I wouldn't have otherwise, but. There's no comparable data for this. I mean, you can't make you can do some statistical analysis on this rich data set, but there's no no corpus you can create with this, and nobody will do this the same work on a similar genre or text or material. So yeah, artificial intelligence is the solution for everything, maybe. Yeah.
Well, I was very much looking forward to the results of the project by Dominique Stutzmann on creating ontology of variant letter forms, but it's somehow it maybe a project that will be in perpetual evolution, because every of the typologies that we use in our fields are always evolving. So we need to keep dynamic textual editions. So it's hard to have a definitive format that will never move.
So Paolo has taken seat in the plane.
Yes, apparently I did. I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you very much for that answer. And that polarity between small, precise work, handmade, and massive industry level work with a percentage of error, something that I haven't solved myself in my own experience. But you have convinced me. You have started convincing me that we should more work on a wide level with HCR and stuff. Otherwise, that question that objection that they make to us will never. We won't be ever able to defeat it. So unless this really becomes easier and the computer really helps us to do that, there's no way we can win that battle. I don't know, I'm being pessimistic maybe. But thank you very much. We'll continue this conversation for sure in another way. Thanks.
Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. And
That's exactly what they're about to say.
I think if there are no further comments or important questions, I think we should thank again Jean-Baptiste for this very full and informative and exciting presentation and discussing. Thank you everyone for participating here in the seminar. Our next seminar is in the next month. I have to check in 27 April. Barbara McGillivray from King's College London, from the Turing Institute, will talk about computational methods for tracing word meaning across time. So another very interesting seminar upcoming. Yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy the evening. We are having now an aperitivo, even though it's very cold in Venice, colder than in Germany. So that's sad, but we can go inside maybe. And everyone who wants to join us, so we will be around here somewhere. Everyone who wants to come to Venice now for aperitivo is also very welcome. Otherwise, you will have your own options from wherever you are. Thank you very much, Jean-Baptiste.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Buona serata.